The steam rises from a chipped porcelain mug, a small swirling cloud in the morning chill of a Rockland kitchen. Tom Garrett wraps his thick, calloused fingers around the warmth, feeling the heat seep into joints that have spent 39 years fighting the unrelenting grip of the North Atlantic. At 58, his hands are a living map of a hard-won life, deeply ridged with scars from salt-crusted ropes and the jagged, rusted edges of lobster traps. Outside the window, the Maine winter is a wall of unforgiving grey, but inside, the house is quiet and warm, marked by the steady, rhythmic ticking of a mahogany wall clock. In the next room, he can hear the soft, domestic rustle of June moving about, a sound that still feels like a quiet miracle to a man who once thought he would die in silence. Tom is a man of few words, the kind who usually leaves his stories in the deep water, but he knows now that the weight of certain secrets becomes too heavy to carry alone. He understands that there is a rare driving necessity in testimony, a reason to speak of the things that defy logic and the voices that emerge when hope is gone. In 1987, Tom was 23 and convinced he had found the center of his world in a woman named Carol Ann. She was beautiful in a way that felt like a promise of a better life, though he would spend the next 2 decades realizing he had mistaken her sharp beauty for goodness. They married young, and almost immediately, his 38-foot lobster boat, the Ellen May, became more than just his livelihood. It became his only true sanctuary. Named after his mother, the boat offered a simple, honest cruelty that he could understand, unlike the psychological landscape of his home. Carol Ann had a way of sucking the oxygen out of every room she entered, demanding that the tides of their life revolve entirely around her shifting moods. It was a suffocating brand of narcissism that turned every joy into a debt. Tom vividly remembers returning from a grueling 30-hour run on his birthday, his eyes burning from salt and exhaustion. He was barely an hour late for a dinner Carol Ann had planned for herself, yet she spent the night berating him for his selfishness, never once asking about the gale he had just survived. To keep the peace, Tom entered the apology cycle, a habit of saying he was sorry for things he hadn't done simply because it was faster than the alternative. He stayed for the children, Ryan and Melissa, viewing his life as a long, silent sacrifice that would never see a reward. When Carol Ann died from pancreatic cancer in 2013, Tom was left in a hollowed-out state of complex grief. He wasn't just mourning the woman who had passed, but the ghost of the partner he had always wished she would be. What followed were the grey years, nearly a decade of absolute solitude in the Rockland house. He fell into a rigid rhythm of survival, eating his dinner alone at exactly 5:30 every evening, while the television hummed for background noise. He never really watched the screen. He just needed the artificial sound to drown out the heavy stillness of the rooms. He believed his heart had finished its work and was now merely a mechanical pump. However, his daughter Melissa refused to let him fade away. Her constant, loving insistence eventually wore him down, leading him toward a Tuesday night potluck supper at the local church hall, a small step into the light that he never saw coming. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The church hall in Rockland felt smaller than it was, crowded with the heavy scent of damp wool coats and the steam rising from rows of ceramic casserole dishes. For Tom, attending the Tuesday night potluck was an exercise in social obligation, a promise kept to his daughter Melissa to finally step back into the world. He moved through the line with the practiced invisibility of a man used to the shadows, his scarred hands tucked into his pockets. Then he heard it, a laugh that cut through the low murmur of polite conversation like a bell in the fog. It was June Hartley. She was sitting across the long, folding table, her face lit by the buzzing fluorescent lights. Yet she looked radiant. When her eyes met his, she didn't look away with the usual awkwardness people offered a widower. Instead, she held his gaze with a quiet, knowing warmth that made him feel seen for the first time in decades. Tom cleared his throat, his voice sounding rusty even to himself. "Is that broccoli casserole?" he asked, pointing to the dish in front of her. June smiled, a genuine expression. "Yes, but I'd skip the crust," she replied with a wink. That brief exchange was the first real conversation Tom had enjoyed in years. On the drive home, He sat in his truck in the driveway, the engine clicking as the heat dissipated. For the first time, the silence of his house felt like an intruder rather than a companion. What followed was a courtship built on the fragile architecture of the twice broken. Neither was looking for a whirlwind. They were looking for a harbor. For 3 months, they learned the contours of each other's lives with a hesitant, profound respect. June would show up at the Rockland docks just as the Ellen May was tying up, bringing the kind of quiet presence Tom had forgotten existed. In return, Tom drove over to Camden on his days off, silently replacing the rotted boards on her porch steps without being asked. These were the acts of service that spoke louder than any grand declaration ever could. In September, they walked the mile-long Rockland breakwater, the massive granite stones uneven and cold beneath their boots. When Tom reached out and took June's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against his calluses, it felt like a tectonic shift in his soul. That night, back in his truck, the dam finally broke. He cried until his chest ached, weeping for the decades of loneliness and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was no longer alone. It was a release he hadn't known he needed, a loosening of a knot that had been tied tight since 1987. On the morning of October 14, 2019, the air held a biting clarity that usually signaled a change in the season. Tom was preparing the Ellen May for a 2-day run, checking the bait and the fuel lines with the steady focus of a veteran. June stood on the pier, her coat collar turned up against the sharp wind, watching him work. As he pulled away from the slip, Tom did something he rarely did. He looked back. He saw her there, a small but steadfast figure against the Maine coastline, waving until the boat rounded the point. The weather forecast had promised a manageable swell, but the North Atlantic is a deceptive mistress. 12 hours out, the sky bruised into a sickly purple, and the wind began to howl with a predatory intensity. The Ellen May pitched violently as the waves grew into grey mountains. The hull groaned under the relentless assault of the freezing water. In the chaos of a sudden rogue gust, the heavy boom swung wildly across the deck. Tom never saw it coming. The blow to the side of his head was absolute, sending him crashing to the freezing, salt-slicked deck. Darkness swallowed him before he could even register the pain. He lay unresponsive as the aging boat began to groan under the pressure. The Ellen May was taking on water, listing dangerously at 30 degrees, a ghost ship drifting into the heart of the killing storm. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a heavy, cold weight pressing against Tom's soul. He was drifting in a void where the roar of the Atlantic had been replaced by an eerie, ringing silence. But then, through the fog of his fading consciousness, a sound pierced the veil. It wasn't a scream or a thunderclap. It was a voice, clear and resonant, speaking a single word: Tom. It didn't come from the wind or the waves. It felt as though someone were leaning over him on that salt-slicked deck, their presence calm and physical, their breath warm against the freezing spray. The sound of his own name acted like an anchor, dragging him back from the edge of the abyss. When his eyes snapped open, the world was a chaotic blur of grey water and screaming wind. He was sliding toward the gunwale, the Ellen May listing so sharply that the sea was already pouring over the rail. His fingers, numb and stiff, brushed against the cold metal of the emergency bilge handle. In his panicked state, his instinct was to pull it, to do anything to stop the water, but the voice remained, a lingering echo in his mind that brought a sudden, sharp clarity. He remembered the fault he had neglected, a rusted valve that would turn the intake into an open wound. If he pulled that handle, he wouldn't be saving the boat. He would be inviting the Atlantic to swallow him whole. Instead of pulling, he found the strength to crawl away, dragging his battered body toward the cabin and the flickering lights of the radio. 4 hours later, the orange searchlights of a Coast Guard Jayhawk cut through the storm, finding the Ellen May just as her engines gave their final, sputtering gasp. By the time Tom was settled into a bed at the hospital, the adrenaline had vanished, leaving only a bone-deep ache. Ryan and Melissa were there first, their faces etched with a terror that only began to soften when they saw him breathe. But it was 3 o'clock in the morning when the door creaked open again and June arrived, having driven through the night from Camden. She didn't say a word at first. She simply sat by the bed and took his scarred hand in hers, her touch the only medicine he truly needed. "You looked back," she whispered. her voice trembling with the weight of the hours she spent waiting. Tom squeezed her hand, a tear tracking through the dried salt on his cheek. "I know," he replied. In that moment, he understood the miracle wasn't just the voice in the storm. It was the fact that he finally had something worth surviving for. He wasn't just a man waiting for his heart to stop pumping. He was a man with a destination. The recovery was slow, but it was marked by a newfound sense of purpose. A week after returning home, Tom stood on the deck of the Ellen May in the quiet harbor, finally fixing that mechanical fault on the bilge. It was a mundane task, grease staining his knuckles, but he handled the wrench with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. That Sunday, he walked through the doors of his mother's old Methodist church. He didn't sit in the back. He took his place in the same wooden pew from his childhood, the grain of the wood familiar beneath his palms. When the minister invited the congregation to pray, Tom didn't offer a long sermon. He closed his eyes and whispered 2 words, "Thank you." On a crisp November morning shortly after, Tom and June stood together on the granite blocks of the Rockland breakwater. The Atlantic was still there, enormous and indifferent, but the terror was gone. The miracle was that 39 years of a hard life hadn't broken him enough to miss the call. Now, sitting here in this warm Rockland kitchen, the memory of the storm feels like a lifetime ago. Outside, the winter wind rattles the window pane, but inside, there is a peace that passes all understanding. I hear the soft clink of June's coffee cup hitting the counter in the next room, a simple domestic sound that is the music of a life reclaimed. People ask me about theology, but I tell them there is a difference between a theology and a testimony. A theology is what you think about God. A testimony is what you know He did for you when the water was over your head. I survived because I was called back by a love I had spent a lifetime trying to deserve. For every soul drifting in their own storm, I offer this truth. You are never as alone as the waves want you to believe. If you found strength in this story, I ask you to type the word "returned" in the comments. It is a testament to every soul that found its way back to the light. God bless you, and God bless America.